Meanwhile, very much off Broadway, USA 4, Ireland 0, USA 4, Ireland 0. So, Dave, you were out at these games. Sunday's one was in Cincinnati. Where was were they both?
No, last Thursday or Friday morning here was Denver.
Denver, yes. So I watched the Cincinnati game, and it settled into a pretty firm pattern. You can imagine back five, backs against the wall, USA with the ball, away we go. And when I read that it was a very similar performance and game in Denver, I thought I just don't have the time to watch that game. But I get the gist. You were there for both.
Yeah, I slightly quibble in terms of like they switched to back five after half time. It was a half a game on Sunday. It was a half a game. I mean, there was an effective admission that whether technically, but definitely physically, mentally, they could not go on. They blew up in Denver in the 50th minute with the altitude and the heat and the lack of class.
And up until that point?
They conceded a second just before half time, then conceded the third around 50-54. But just physically, they blew up.
Yeah.
And the game was probably up at the first whistle, but the game was effectively up then. And they were, even in game one, in that game in Denver, they were looking at I'll go into it probably in a bit. They were looking at the stats in terms of who can go on here, and they were struggling even to make early subs. So,
right.
By the time they got to Phoenix, by the time they got to Cincinnati, and you're already down to players, which we'll probably speak about. Katie McCabe's not there, Eva Mannion's not there, Heather Payne's not there. They're down Denise O'Sullivan, Megan and Campbell 2 days out from the first game, so they're down bodies. And given the experience of Denver, like they knew they wouldn't be able to go beyond 50, which again we'll talk about what's the point. And I did ask that question even before the second game. So they effectively canned the game. The game stopped. Like I was a boring kind of work thing. I had to file because it was on Irish time, but there's a print deadline. I had to file. You're told on the whistle, but the whistle, because of a 7-minute delay with anthems and paraphernalia and hydration breaks and injury time, the whistle would have been near 10 o'clock. So I kind of had to file 20, 25 minutes before the end of the match. I did that easily. I just had to tell them there's been another goal here, guys, change the scoreline.
So it was just the second half in Cincinnati. They went to the back five.
Yeah. Well, they changed around a bit in Denver, but they were able to kind of... they were physically engaged in the game more. Not that they did anything in it. They had 2 shots and...
Yeah.
There were statistical kind of fancies really on behalf of the nerds who compile these things, but like effectively they didn't contribute anything because they couldn't contribute anything in the second half. Physically, yeah. And I mean there'd been a threat of thunderstorms which delayed our return home, but I was talking to Carla Ward about that because you remember the Club World Cup, the Cincinnati game was delayed, I think about an hour, whatever game was there 2 weeks ago. Everyone's forgotten it already, obviously, but we saw at the Chelsea game what can happen at the weekend, and there had been that threat, and Ireland had a flight booked back to Heathrow at 10 p.m. local time, and Carla kind of, I thought half jokingly, but said we'll take them off because it was getting to that stage of the trip. So that kind of sums up where we're at. Like, went out minus a lot of players, lost more players as they went in, quickly realised that physically those that were up to it were struggling to keep up to it, and those who they had hoped might be up to it were never going to be able to get up to it. And therein ends the sporting aspect of it, and whether not morally, that's a bit too deep, but whether tactically and logistically it was the correct thing to do. The squad and manager believe it was. I kind of find it vaguely dubious because it's a lot of this in sport postponed evidence. So the process, the learnings, we learn from mistakes. You'll see it against Belgium, etc., etc., etc. But sitting here right now in an admittedly studio which is warmer than Connecticut and Denver put together, I didn't see the point of it.
Yeah. Maeve, your thoughts on the two matches? Like I said, I'm at a disadvantage. I saw the second half of the second game, and at that stage Ireland were in a back five, and it was like a kind of training game of backs versus forwards. There wasn't even the possibility of Ireland getting into the US half. So I just found it very tough to stomach going back to watch the other the other game. What about the other three halves then? I've bluntly summed up the second half of the second match.
Yeah, it was probably a lot of the same, to be honest. You obviously have that bit of hope and expectation at the start of the first game, thinking that this might be different considering the amount of changes that the US had made. I mean, they arrested all their European-based players apart from Naomi Girma, who's just coming back from injury. So they had on paper a depleted squad, but in reality, like I think they can pull from any number of players and they'd still be able to compete with the best in the world. And they put out an entire second 11 or a different 11 for the second game, whereas I think we kind of struggle, like Dave mentioned, missing all those players, and we really were looked quite limited, to be honest. But I suppose it was it was a case of was Carla's first friendly camp as well, which I think you can kind of that's a positive in a way, because you're limited when you're in a competitive camp to kind of change anything or even just try different things, maybe even off the pitch as well, that type of thing, just to get to know the players more, and just the schedule, off the pitch. And I think it was a case of either this friendly or no friendly. I don't think there was a European option, so you'd be going from the Nations League straight into the playoff. It's a long time, I think, till October, not playing any game. And of course, as well, US Soccer cover a lot of these trips. I know they did in the past when we played them, so it's not a case of that these ones might be extortionate costs or anything in that sense. But obviously, the quality on the pitch, then I think we were really outclassed. It was, like I said, it was kind of difficult to watch, or a lot of deja vu. Really,
Yeah.
really. I know the last kind of couple of games we managed to keep the scoreline down when we did play them, but yeah, I think the score lines were very fair reflections on the game. We didn't really have any notable attacking opportunities, and it was very much sitting deep. Like you said, she did revert to a back five, which she said she wouldn't be changing the system. She'd be keeping with her 4-3-3, but I think maybe given the conditions and the opponents and everything, I think it was a wise decision to go to that back five. And I think at times it does suit us, just given the
Yeah.
quality that we have in those centre back areas.
That's kind of the thing. Like, given the opposition, given the bodies missing for Ireland, you couldn't even look at it and say, "Well, this is not good enough. We need to have an inquisition." It was almost like these two are just so far apart. There's very little you can kind of say, "Well, come on, manager, you got to do better." It was just like you sit there and take it.
Yeah, I mean, and she had signposted Maeve the back five in the second game for those reasons, because they literally knew they couldn't physically compete and affect the game as much as they wanted to, or deploy a decent bench. Yeah, I mean, I actually found myself at times in Cincinnati, even in the first half, watching good players. I mean, I felt sorry for Jessie Stapleton, played out of position. She's established herself at 20 as a centre half, is going to play Diane Caldwell, Niamh Fahey, Louise Quinn-Amounts for Ireland, in my humble opinion, if she, once club career injuries don't intervene. And I felt sorry for her. She playing right back, out of position because of absentees, and even a couple of other players, when they were just receiving the ball and just physically unable to do anything with it, and mentally they were cooked. And okay, there is a skill deficit, which again, from the start of game one, was easily identifiable. This game cannot play the passing possession game that Carla Ward wants, but we've had that debate before. But I actually felt kind of, and I hate saying this about sport, but I felt kind of sympathy for them, trying to perform impossible tasks, upon which it was also impossible to kind of judge them as rigidly as one should a professional sports outfit. So having said that, it might have been nice just to see one or two things, a different goalkeeper for even 45 minutes, because if you're going to lose 4-0 twice anyway, chucking a goalkeeper that we really haven't seen. We've only seen Grace Maloney, I think, for one game in the last 2 or 3 years, and Courtney Brosnan gets injured between playoff 1 and 2. What are you going to do? But apart from that, I mean, I heard calls even from home that the under-19s, some of them may have been introduced, but like Ella Malloy, Hayley Nolan, Ella Malloy didn't get on, but even Izzy Atkinson, Erin Healy, Hayley Nolan, like, they were doing tests that the elaborate number of staff can do on the players, as in what are they capable of doing from day to day in training and then on a match day, and the numbers were restricted. It was literally 10 minutes here, 50 minutes here, 10 minutes there. So to say that, you could just rock out with the under-19s or 3 or 4 of them. Joy Ralph, there's good players there.
How high? The altitude? One thing. How hot was it on Sunday? Humidity?
Well, it seems to be hot all over the world, and that's a kind of global warming kind of episode you need to do. Like, I mean, I saw Maeve and Des last night baking in Basel. I see Cian Tracy is getting torrential heat in Tbilisi. Rudd is escaping it in Australia, but it was the humidity in Cincinnati was the killer. You're over 90% humidity, and it didn't dip below 30 degrees centigrade on kickoff time in the midday sun. Denver's
the kickoff
altitude,
time.
Denver's altitude was the issue there. That you're gasping for breath. It's okay for middle-aged people like me who don't move around too quickly. That you don't need to be gulping for air, but for athletes, it was tough. But listen, if you're going to go to a World Cup and stuff, and again, there's a professional argument here. But
you'll have to deal with it. Maeve, could I ask you? So everything Dave said there, totally accept, and had the same feeling of I'm not sure this warrants the rigorous analysis of other games. The one thing you could quibble with, though, is the Carla Ward way, and that's a phrase she has used about herself. Possession-based football in that heat, as well as dropping into a back five and bracing yourself. The one thing you could at least aspire to do as a group is, well, can we have a few patterns where we can actually keep the ball for 2-3 minutes, for 10, 15 passes, and play our way into the game a little bit that way. There's no evidence yet. There's no evidence yet in any of the games, really, that Carla Ward is going to get this team playing possession-based football.
No, there's not really. And playing the number one team in the world in their own backyard is probably not the best way of trying to implement that as a game plan. I think, the Americans really were on it. Like, I know I said it was a completely changed team, but the issue there is that all these players are trying to then make it into that starting 11 and make it into the squads going forward. So they're, even almost have more aggression, more hunger than the regular players. So they were just in the Irish girls' face all the time. The likes of Alyssa Thompson on the left wing was incredible. One of the up and coming players. Her sister Giselle came on as well, and just the two of them really lit it up. On the nights they were playing, and it just trying to play out, it wasn't really going to work, and we just didn't have enough, I think, sustained pressure, particularly in the midfield. Like, Denise O'Sullivan was just such a vital cog in the way that we do want to play, and I think her absence was really, really felt. Kind of couldn't really get a hold of the ball I can't recall any stages really in the game to be able to play, like I said, that kind of possession based football, at least at times, or in periods of the game.
Yeah, I'm not even saying penetrating passes into midfield, breaking the lines. I'm talking about, can we make the field big in our half and just keep the ball? That kind of know-how almost didn't really seem there, and I would have thought that would have been one of the things you'd aspire to do.
Yeah, but I think as well, maybe it's we're playing that back four, like I said, for 3 of the halves, and I think maybe the way America were playing, they were so high, they were so pushed up. They did start with a back four, but they actually pushed up their right wing back right up to the wing, so they were essentially playing with a back three, and just that pressure then was on us. They had an outside right player, and then they had an inside right player playing in the channel, and there wasn't the pressure was there, and we couldn't even skip that first pass.
Yeah, fair enough.
But it is interesting, like in Denver, Ireland did start their four quite high up in the evidence of my eyes, and they started the game, and again, it's probably the heat, but I described it as walking football. They were, passing along the back as teams are wont to do, and then it was just a ball into the channel for poor Amber to huff and puff, and that seemed to be the gambit. And there's an element of the Carla Ward football mixed with Ireland football that we were promised and supposed to be grateful for in Slovenia, in Cork against Slovenia, where there was that element of, I know Denise was playing, but almost bypassing the midfield at times and playing a really kind of intense pressure game, and they had about 5 minutes of that in the first half in Cincinnati, where there was a bit of good pressing, and they won the ball back. And Emily Murphy had about two or three good moments on the right. One where she actually got a layoff from Saoirse, she was picked for the second game as a kind of hold-up merchant and passed off. And Emily had a nice burst and could have played Kira in on the right. You might remember that, Maeve. They had a good 5-10 minutes before, which could have been a chance, could have been 1-1, could have been something. Only scored one goal ever before against the US. But apart from that, and listen, Joe, I've had this, and even, we see Hamer Helgrimsson almost doing it, sometimes avoiding the midfield, because Ireland don't have in the men's game, they don't have a midfield, haven't had for many years, and Stephen Kenny and Mick McCarthy would have seen that as well. So you just bypass it. I mean, in a different way than Jack Charlton used to do. He just ignored midfields anyway. And there is a sense that, sometimes you've got to do that, and I think that was kind of the philosophy they tried to do in Slovenia, and you might have to do it against Belgium, because if there was a point to this exercise, it's the blatantly obvious how to play without the ball. You'd hope Belgium won't have as much of it as the USA, and at the times when Ireland have it, they can deploy it better. But I used to again rage against this in the days of Martin and Brian, even and Stan, about Wes Hoolahan. It's not about trying to play like Barcelona. The whole point about Wes Hoolahan was that he would keep the ball and give it to somebody, maybe even backwards, but there's only one ball, and you keep it. So again, it's not looking to kind of play like Spain it's just retaining possession, because the longer you have it, the other guys don't. So,
Maeve, to the point where I was trying to assess the value of this whole experience, maybe Belgium will be the real litmus test. It doesn't quite feel like that period where Vera Pauw was playing really tough opposition, and it culminated with that win against Australia in the friendly, and you thought, this is going to stand to them. They're teak tough now against this level. Doesn't quite feel like that at the moment. Maybe it'll benefit us. What's your hunch, though?
Yeah, I mean, like that, we were completely, I think, outplayed. But the types, I suppose, the one thing they could take from it is that experience, the big game experience. Like, I remember playing a few trips. We went on to America, and like every game you played in was such an intense atmosphere, like a cauldron, really. And packed out stadiums, 20,000 people, and that's still, even playing in that alone, albeit getting hammered like they did, 4-0. I suppose we are going to call it what it is, but at the same time, even just having gone through that together, like, is something at least that then when they do face the big games again. But in that sense, you would love to have maybe seen the even less experienced players get on the pitch and have a taste of that. The likes of the Ellen Malloys, obviously Hayley Nolan did get on for a half, so that was good to see. But even those fringe players, Izzy Atkinson, who Dave mentioned as well, just even to give those that bit more experience, so that they could have felt that too, and then be able to benefit from that at least. And yeah, I mean, it's a long way to go in that, to go for the game. But like I said, I think, from what I heard, it was that game or no game. So I think in that regard, it was definitely positive to have a camp, and a camp of that length as well, ahead of the October playoff, because that would have just been a huge gap, especially when a lot of those players mightn't have been playing the likes of the minutes that, say, Katie McCabe had at Arsenal this season. Yeah,
it's true. And you would give Carla Ward great credit for not saying to the likes of McCabe and others, tough luck, you're coming. I don't really care about minutes. I want you there. So, there was a player welfare aspect to this, which is very admirable. Dave, as a final one, you're out there, you're doing press conferences. How is Carla Ward finding all this?
Yeah, like, Carla's engaging, and she speaks as much as the truth as she, I think, wants to. Even sometimes she's not allowed to, but she does in terms of injuries and stuff. She's quite open. So I try and separate that from what I see in terms of rigorous analysis, etc. So, I've known managers who are friendly, but I've had to criticise them, and vice versa. Sometimes it coalesces, which is always nice, but it doesn't necessarily. I mean, even she struggled with conditions She said she walking up the stairs in Denver and struggled to catch breath. So I told her to get a bloody lift. But she was doing an exercise with Izzy Atkinson in training one day and really kind of struggled out of it. And she was good talking about I get a sense that the FAI or the nabobs, as I call them, the higher ups, wouldn't have liked her to talk about the conditions and the player welfare aspects, and especially on Sunday, the 5 or 6 players pleading to come off, as she said to me afterwards. Interestingly, Juve about 10 of their players requested to go off. So
right,
that was an interesting numerical contrast. But I guess the FAI wouldn't have been, because as Meadbh says, this was in planning since November, obviously pre-Euros calamity, and she gets on well with Emma Hayes, and Ireland get on well with the US, and there's probably a quid pro quo coming. There's an Aviva big payday in the pipeline being promised, I guess, because the FAI officials were out there. I'd say there might have been a bit of squirming when she kind of went on about that, because there wasn't much of it from the US side, because obviously, one, they're used to the heat. They won tournaments in heat before, and they play there all the time, and there's a bit more cheerleading going on, it seems, with a lot of them. So that was, admirable. It was honest of her to do that. And it feeds into a larger debate about, as you talked about before, whether it's player burnout or general global sport. What are we doing playing games in baking heat and World Cups, as we'll discover in 27 with the men. But generally she's, I'm dismissive of a lot of the Carla Ward, this talking in the third person. Sorry, don't, please. There's an element of like, aren't you pixie heads? You should be grateful to have the experience of Carla Ward football. I don't buy that.
I don't get, that's harsh on her. I don't get the offer.
Well, no. I'm interpreting the pixie headed thing, but the Carla Ward. When someone talks in the third person, I'm immediately. I just find it ridiculous. But that's in any phase of life, and maybe it's a bit harsh. But I have written that, so it's nothing I haven't said before. But I just think, like, she tried to explain the 4-0 in Slovenia when Sasha Coleman basically worked out her every move in that game, from first whistle to mid-half break to half-time break. And, Carla said, maybe that's what happens when you've been watching my teams for 7 or 8 years. And I thought one of the most ridiculous excuses or explanations I've ever heard in my life. So sometimes I just find maybe it's a modern manager stuff, processes, learnings, outcomes, believing what we're doing, all kind of nebulous kind of concepts, which, when you're behind the lines, you're outside the tent, you don't see. So you can only write what you see, and as we alluded to earlier, the evidence on the pitch is not really far removed from like the 2 years we had under Ida Gleeson, when it was all about possession football and learning against France twice, England twice, Sweden twice, and yet it didn't happen. So it's, I think, important to be as sceptical as possible. Again, from the bleachers, assessing all this. When in the first, even if you disregard the last week's evidence, if the evidence on the pitch hasn't been as spectacular, and she did claim that last week would be more beneficial than all 6 Nations League games put together. So again, I'm just a bit sceptical about stuff like that, but that's probably my nature.
Okay. Well, it's a break now, and then Belgium over the horizon and Euros in the meantime. So, Meadbh, I'm sure we'll catch up with you across the tournament over the next few weeks. Safe flight home. Thanks a mil.
Cheers. Thanks a million.
See you, Meadbh.
And Dave Kelly, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Joe.